the final days of August 1922, a voice marked the end of a dream. The Turks are surrounding us. We are losing the war. Retreat. By early September, panic had swept through the Greek military and political leadership. The chain of command had collapsed, and the British proposal to delay the Turkish advance through diplomacy had been rejected. Mustafa Kemal pointed to Izmir as the only valid location for negotiation. But the Greek command, many of whom would later fall captive to Turkish forces, realized that even Izmir could not be held. They began urgently planning the evacuation of troops and officials. The Greek forces and politicians were split into two camps, royalists and Venizelists. Now, the tide had clearly turned in favor of the Venizelists. With support from abroad, ships arriving at Izmir's port began shuttling people to nearby islands like Lesbos and Chios, almost like passenger ferries. Coordination was in the hands of Venizelist officers. Lesbos and Chios became so overcrowded that there was hardly space to stand. If the refugees were to continue to Athens, civil unrest seemed inevitable. Since losing the 1920 elections, many Venizelist figures had been removed from office or sidelined. Now, they demanded revenge. The war had begun with their occupation of Izmir, and it had ended with the royalists abandoning all of western Anatolia. For them, the king had to abdicate, and both the royalist prime minister and generals had to be tried. On September 11, 1922, Colonel Nikolaos Plastiras, Colonel Stylianos Gonatas, and Naval Lieutenant Dimitrios Fokas launched a military uprising against the king and the government. More Venizelist soldiers joined them daily. They called upon former Prime Minister Venizelos, who was in Paris at the time, to return and take charge. Venizelos began preparing. The revolutionary soldiers also gained widespread support from the Greek public. On September 25th, the king and his government were forced to resign. On September 26th, rebel forces began seizing control in Athens. On September 27th, King Constantine abdicated in favor of his son and left the country. By September 28th, the Revolutionary Committee was the sole authority. With Venizelos' approval, royalist supporters of the king and government were arrested one by one. Venizelos was eliminating his political enemies, though through others, not by his own hand. Still, some historians argue that Venizelos had no direct involvement in the trials. Those arrested included two former prime ministers, the ministers of justice, finance, foreign affairs, interior, war, and transportation, Admiral Stratios, Admiral Goudas, and the commander-in-chief of the Asia Minor Army, General Georgios Hatzianestis. Hatzianestis had assumed command just 3 months before the Great Offensive began. Speaking defiantly from his headquarters in Izmir, he told reporters, "I toured the entire front, but I did not encounter any commander named Mustafa Kemal." On October 19, 1922, a commission led by General Theodoros Pengalos began a formal inquiry. A military court composed of 10 officers quickly formulated the charges. In summary, the accusations were as follows: misleading the public in 1920 to support King Constantine's return, ignoring Allied proposals and keeping them secret from the Greek people, replacing competent officers with politically loyal but unqualified ones, dismissing General Papok and disregarding his advice, following the king's orders over their commanders, reopening debate on the Treaty of Sèvres, appointing the erratic General Hatzianestis as commander-in-chief, wasting public funds, withdrawing key units from Asia Minor, weakening the army, and encouraging Turkish attacks, forgiving debts owed to Greece by foreign states, ultimately committing treason. The trials began on November 13, 1922, and lasted for 15 days. Fearing the Turkish invasion, Greek troops were stationed in Thrace during this time. The accused denied all charges of treason. Public interest in the trial was immense. General Hatzianestis defended himself by attacking his predecessor, General Papoulas. "I only commanded for 2.5 months. My predecessor served for 20 months. It's not fair to blame me for the death of Asia Minor. Why punish the last doctor summoned to a dying patient when the earlier doctors prescribed the wrong treatment?" Papoulas, in turn, blamed former Prime Minister Gounaris, claiming that the Battle of Sakarya had been forced upon him by the king and Gunaris. Once the battle began, he said, they failed to provide the necessary support, resulting in defeat and a major morale boost for the Turks. Mustafa Kemal's name came up repeatedly during the trials. Hatzianestis explained why he had diverted troops to Istanbul instead of reinforcing the Anatolian front. I took the operation against Istanbul seriously. It was a supply base for the Kemalists. I learned that Kemal had ordered 400 airplanes, 1,000 machine guns, and 150,000 rifles. I warned General Harrington and the government that when these arrived, Kemal would have superior firepower. Back in Izmir, Trikupi told me there were many desertions at the front. The enemy had acquired 30 new reconnaissance planes. I requested air reinforcements, but nothing came. The court seemed to have already made its decision, but Hatzianestis continued. He described the final battle. At first, Trikupi sent encouraging telegrams, but the next morning he requested reinforcements. I realized he intended to defeat the enemy on the spot, a mistake. Holding Afyon endangered us. Then I lost contact with Trikupi. Neither scouts nor aircraft could locate him. I only learned of his capture from Turkish communiques. Even Bonaparte couldn't have saved us under those conditions. The retreat turned into a panic after the defeat near Uşak, but all armies suffered defeats and moments of panic. The real mistake was trying to hold such a vast front with inadequate forces, especially after abandoning Cilicia. If places like Dumlupinar and Eskişehir are now considered Turkish, blame my predecessor. But if I am to be punished simply because I was the last one in charge, then it is unjust. Remember, your honors, some are crowned with laurel who do not deserve it, while others are forced to wear thorns they did not earn. Soon, the public began loudly demanding executions. Despite efforts by the British ambassador in Athens to intervene, the Revolutionary Committee saw swift executions as the best way to avoid foreign pressure. So swift, in fact, that the condemned men did not even hear the verdict. They learned of their sentences from inside their cells. Despite warnings from Allied powers, the court found them guilty of treason for supporting the return of King Constantine, using terror to maintain royalist power, triggering the collapse of the Treaty of Sèvres, Hatzianestis' failed offensive toward Istanbul, leaving supply depots for the Turks, leading to the collapse of the Asia Minor front, and ultimately causing the death of thousands of Greek soldiers. 2 men were sentenced to life in prison, 1 was exiled. According to the November 28, 1922 newspaper, the executions were carried out as follows. The condemned accepted the verdict calmly. The prosecutor allowed them until 11 a.m. to write their wills, see their families, and receive religious rites. Afterward, Colonel Grigoriadis removed Hatzianestis' military decorations. After writing their wills and saying farewell to their families, a priest arrived at 10:30 to offer final prayers. At 11 a.m., they were taken from prison in 2 military ambulances. A 30-man firing squad made up of Cretan soldiers stood 15 meters away, divided into groups of 5, 1 for each condemned man. 2 high-ranking officers stood at attention throughout the execution. From left to right, the prisoners were Theotokis, Stratos, Gunaris, Protopapadakis, Baltazis, and General Hatzianestis. They remained calm until the very end. Stratos handed Gunaris a cigarette moments before the execution. Gunaris took a few final puffs. Stratos then told him, "Have courage. This is our fate." Theotokis made the sign of the cross on his chest. Baltazis asked the soldiers to aim for his heart, pointing to it with his hand. None of the condemned requested blindfolds. At 11:28 a.m., the lieutenant drew his sword and gave the order. The gunfire rang out and 6 bodies collapsed to the ground. Then, a corporal from each group approached and fired a final bullet into the head. The bodies were delivered to their families and taken to the cemetery. As for Trikupis, who succeeded Hatzianestis, but was captured by the Turks before assuming command, he was never tried, thanks to Mustafa Kemal, who held him in Kayseri and later released him in a prisoner exchange. In a way, Trikupis survived because of Mustafa Kemal, and he would speak respectfully of him for the rest of his life. These are the final victims of reckless British and Greek political ambition. This concludes another episode. If you'd like to see more historical stories like this, don't forget to follow. Take care.